discuss the opportunity or chance of considering refinancing of a pension obligation that the county has. And Jay, would you like to share your findings?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Again, I apologize for being late. We had met, I think, early June, I believe it was. And so I tried to update this, but a little bit of a refresher, and I couldn't remember exactly who was in that first presentation, so I hope maybe we just start over briefly. And as you know, you have about a $24 million unfunded liability, which is the topic of the conversation, which for 2016 produces an annual retirement contribution, which we call an ARC, of just under $2.9 million, which is down from about $4.2 million in 2015. Most of that reduction in the ARC is due to the fact that you deposited $10 million into the plan in the middle of 2015. The unfunded portion is approximately between $2 million and $2.1 million. So what we're addressing in this conversation is the unfunded portion. You will always have what we call the normal cost, which is the difference between the 2.86 and the call it 2.1 million. Somewhere between, it's about $750,000, which, regardless of what you do, will always be there. We would expect, given market performance, that the unfunded liability for at the end of 2016 will certainly not be less. It is likely to be a little higher, but we'll see what happens when the actual asset plan is produced a year from now. One of the most significant assumptions in the actuarial pension plan is that the plan assets earn 7.5% every year. So that is essentially your cost of borrowing that $24 million unfunded portion, because it's supposed to be earning 7.5 and it's not. So the liability is accruing at 7.5. To the extent your plan on average earns more than 7.5, you are eating into that a little bit. But when you look at your mix of equity and fixed income, about, call it 65-35, and assuming in this rate environment that fixed income is not doing 7.5%, it really means your equity portion of the plan has to produce more than 10-11% every year, just on average, to get to that 7.5%. We see that when you look back at your 10-year average of about 6% average rate of return in the plan, and what most people are saying the market holds for the future. We see double-digit equity returns as being pretty challenging. And so again, the net result of that is you're funding the unfunded liability at 7.5%. And so the question and proposition is there a less expensive way to fund that unfunded portion, in which you said, okay, let's go find out whether or not there is. So we had contacted some local banks. We received two proposals, one from Fulton and one from Integrity, which is now S&T, and we had conversations or dialogue with two underwriters, one being RBC Capital Markets and the other being Stifel Nicholas, which is also your plan asset manager, or at least manager of managers, and actually got some very compelling results back. Fulton Bank offered a fixed rate for 7 years at 3.6, with a cap at 5.75 for the remaining 13 years over a 20-year period. If you want to extend this to 25 years, then the cap would extend to year 25.
What was that,
5.75 is the cap, so that's the highest the rate could go after the 7-year fixed rate period. If we stay in this rate environment, obviously the reset in year 8 would be lower, but because we don't know, we have to calculate numbers based on caps. We got a proposal from S&T/Integrity with a cap at 5.71, but also a higher initial rate, so it was a little less competitive than the full proposal. The most compelling funding option came from Stifel Nicholas, and over 20 years it's about 3.9%, over 25 years it's right on 4%. So the difference between, we call it 4% and 3.5 basis points, over 25 years produces a net present value benefit of a little over $10 million. So on a $24 million, call it borrowing, the present value benefit over 25 years is almost half of that at $10.4 million. We kind of fooled around with how you would employ all that, because if we do this financing between now and the end of the year, or more importantly, before you make the 2016 ARC, you would have the unfunded portion of the 2016 ARC that we could use to downsize the issue. And so we looked at that and said, okay, what's the best way to employ that along with your existing debt? And as you recall, you're out of debt in a few years, 7 or 8 years. And so we looked at this as, you know, what we call a quasi wraparound, where we would defer some of the principal for the first few years. DCD will allow a few years of that, and essentially use that $2 million to offset principal payments in the early years, and then it gets fully loaded. And then as your current GO debt drops off, then you would just have just this pension obligation debt. And so I'll start with that one. Just this gets a little confusing because it's a lot of numbers, but I thought it would be helpful to see it on paper. And just bear with me. I thought if we did this one page at a time where everybody's looking at the same numbers, it might be a little easier. So the left column, far left, obviously is the fiscal year we're dealing with. And the annual retirement contribution is the unfunded portion. And we had, because I'm not an actuary, I had actually asked an independent actuary to calculate these numbers for us based on all the assumptions in the plan. And so you can see that the unfunded portion is approximately $2 million through 2023, then it drops for a few years, actually hits an unusual low point in 2028, and then it starts ramping back up, and it gets as high as $2.8 million in the last 10 years. Now, if you were to smooth all that out, it would be approximately $2.1 million a year, I believe. The second column then is a debt service payment on essentially a $22 million borrowing. Assuming that you would take the $2 million that's in the budget in 2016 for the unfunded portion and use that to downsize the loan. And so then the corresponding debt service payments, principal and interest, from 2017 through 2041 are listed. And we show a debt service payment of $2 million in 2016 because we're essentially using your budgeted money this year to downsize the loan. The corresponding savings or reduction in pension contribution then is the next column. We describe it as savings. And, you know, call it $780,000 through 2022. Dips, and then it goes, starting in 2030, goes back up and rises significantly. So over the life, you save almost $21 million. In our world, we express everything in present value dollars so that you can compare one option to the next with some validity. And the present value of that $20.99 million at a 4.5% discount rate is almost $11.4 million over 25 years. We picked a 25-year term in this particular example because that matches the amortization of the unfunded liability as it exists today. So if we get to the end of 2016 and the unfunded liability is larger, all those numbers in the first column would change because the numbers get adjusted and potentially extended as the unfunded liability might grow. To the extent that the market outperforms the 7.5% assumption, the term of that unfunded liability would not shrink, but the dollar amount would shrink. And I'll stop there. That's a lot of numbers. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have 2 questions up to this point. Who was the independent actuary?
What's the name of that firm? Used to be called Municipal Finance Partners, I believe is right, MFP. But I believe the guy who runs it actually changed it to his name, which I think might be Charles Friedlander Actuarial Services or something like that. I'll get you the exact name. I don't.
I get the last name I didn't catch.
Friedlander. I think it's Freidlander. It's a Harrisburg-based company. And I asked him to do it because they do some actuarial plans for other county clients that we have. And so it was just a friendly face and somebody who was willing to help.
And the cost of this actuarial plan?
Zero, unless you decide to do something. All I did was give him your plan as prepared by the Hay Group and say, can you tell me what it would cost year by year, all other things being equal, to fund the unfunded liability? And the all other things being equal is all of the salaries go up as the plan forecasts, all of the employees retire and or pass away on the actuarially determined dates, and that the plan earns 7.5% every year, no more, no less. So everything has to work in the model, with the only variable being how do you fund it.
And then I guess my last question at this point would be, and this is a very sensitive question, because I highly respect our investing overseer firm, but sometimes putting all your eggs in one basket is not the wisest thing. So if they would also be funding it, is that a wise decision?
Well, the funding is selling bonds in the marketplace, so you don't have a liability to that firm, and you certainly have the ability and authority to reject whatever they tell you they can sell in the marketplace. So, for example, they've given us indicative rates and spread the treasury rates across 25 years with the understanding that if the day they come to market and what they represent by way of a contract to you isn't what they've represented to us by way of communication, we don't have to accept it. So the county doesn't incur any liability just because they would be the underwriter. They really are just a broker in the middle of you as the borrower and investors on the other side who are essentially lending you the money over the term. So your contract over the 25-year term, or whatever term you choose, would be with the investors, not the underwriting firm. They are strictly a placement agent. So it neither heightens nor lessens your exposure to your asset manager. And to the extent you're not comfortable with it, I mean, you don't have to use them. They just produce what we thought was a very attractive alternative. And so we thought that was, you know, given they showed interest, I think it was March when they came in to make the presentation. Yeah. They've been very proactive in communicating with us, and they actually gave us a better proposal than anybody else. So that's the reason. We're not telling you who you have to use as your underwriter.
We've been using RBC Capital for years.
Yes.
And this is literally giving them competition by asking someone else to give us a price.
And there are a lot of ways to deal with that, but it's your choice. If you're uncomfortable with the asset manager being the underwriter, that's your decision. We were just trying to find the best option. And so this really comes down to, you can do the pay-go, as we say, as determined annually, and it's an embedded cost of 7.5%. Because we've had such a significant drop in particular treasury rates of the United States government obligations, the ability to fund it at significantly less than 7.5% exists today. And we reached an all-time low in the 10 and 30-year rates a week and a half ago. So we are still at what are, by data points, all-time lows in treasury rates. And because this is a taxable obligation, it would trade in the marketplace akin to a treasury obligation. So we do have some other options to kind of simplify it a little bit. If we did the same 25 years and we just did level debt service, the benefit is a little higher on a present value basis. It's about $10.4 million. So it's, you can shorten the term to 20 years. It's not matching the term of the unfunded liability, and the easiest apples-to-apples comparison, as we say, is to match terms so that nobody can say, well, it's just less expensive because you shorten the term. I really view this as, you have a long-term mortgage at a rate and somebody's telling you can refinance at a lower rate. You want to take that opportunity. We don't see this as creating more risk in the pension plan. You have about $100 million invested, so in a 65-35 mix, $65 million is in the equity markets. If we took this $24 million and did the same split so that you didn't disrupt your asset allocation, you would be putting approximately call it $14 million into the equity market, so it would go from 65 to round the numbers up to $80 million. Still maintaining the discipline of whatever your asset allocation model is as determined by your asset manager or managers. If you thought that it was the wrong time to put more money in the equity market, you could certainly skew that allocation and put all $24 million into fixed income. That would get you closer to probably 55-45.
So the investment policy would have to be...
You would have to measure an investment policy, yes. Yep. So there are ways to deal with what you might perceive market risk to be on that deposit. I certainly wouldn't suggest, from my opinion, that you would just put it into cash. I think you would want it employed in either the fixed income or the equity markets. But I'm not your asset manager. That really is a conversation to be reserved for their expertise. I just, we view cash as kind of a dead asset in the marketplace today. Going back to the presentation, then, there's a page that looks like this, and I apologize they're not numbered, but the title is Unfunded Liability Payment Options. We looked at 4 basic options, and that certainly isn't the limit, but it was a good place to start. As I said earlier, we looked at 20 and 25-year level debt service, like you would have a home mortgage. And then we looked at the same 20 and 25 years, but using the $2 million of budgeted 2016 unfunded ARC payment to reduce the loan from $24 million to $22 million, which would allow us to reduce the principal payments in the first few years, so that in the aggregate of your current debt and the proposed debt, it would be a little more level than just laying $24 million of level debt service next to the existing debt. Your current debt is approximately
outstanding debt, 20 million.
Your existing debt through 2022 is about $2.8 million a year. Then it drops to $1.6 million, and then you have virtually no debt from 24 through 31. So this was an attempt to even it out a little bit, but still comply with the requirements of the Local Government Unit Debt Act. We have to submit this to the Department of Community and Economic Development for approval, and they've got their view of what debt has to look like. Again, we look at present value savings of more than $10 million as certainly an interesting conversation. You are authorized under the Local Government Unit Debt Act, which they amended in 1994, to allow for pension financing. So, unlike other projects you've done, this would not finance a capital asset. It would finance a contractual obligation to fund an asset plan that is currently underfunded. It doesn't count against your borrowing capacity, so we would not be consuming your ability to finance, in whatever year a new prison or whatever infrastructure the county would have to undertake. Again, it would be a fixed obligation, so it would not be subject to interest rate risk. You would not be subject to credit renewal risk. So once you sell bonds in the marketplace for 20 or 25 years, it's a fixed obligation. The investor bears the interest rate risk, meaning rates might go up and the investment might not look so good. They also bear the credit risk that, in the future the county might not be rated as it is today. It might be a lower rated county. So the point of that is we're not asking the county to incur either interest rate risk or credit risk in this. It's a fixed obligation. You would have a contractual obligation with the bondholders to make debt service payments on an annual basis, which is arguably a little different than your pension obligation, which on one side is a contract with your employees and beneficiaries, but not a contractual obligation to fund. You accrue the liability, but you're not obligated to fund it yet. That's probably coming. The next steps, I guess, well, I would go to, the questions we get most common are, what if the market goes down? And you've heard me say this before, but you have $100 million in there today. The amount that would be going into the equity market, which most people think your exposure is on the same asset mix, would be less than $50 million. So it's not, on a percentage basis, a huge change to an asset plan that presumably you're comfortable with today. But it would be, again, along the same 65-35 asset allocation, unless you go back and amend your investment policy along with the advice of your asset manager. We do have some clients, and we have one right now that is saying, well, I haven't earned 7.5% in a long time. Should I change that assumption to 6 or 6.5 to more closely match what I've done historically, recalculate my liability and finance it? That is an option. We would have to have the Hay Group redo the plan. I can tell you just by comparison to this county that's looking at doing that, if you drop your assumption from 7.5 to 6, your liability would go from 24 to 32, 33 million. So you'd be financing, what is that, an additional 10 million, almost 50% more to drive the asset assumed rate going forward down to your 10-year average. The last 5 years, I think you've averaged pretty close to 7.5, but over 10 years, it's just a tad under 6%, which is consistent with balanced plans. That's not out of line in the marketplace. So again, I'm not the asset manager, and that probably is a conversation you want to have with them. They might have a different idea of whether or not you should be throwing another 14 million in the equity market or in the fixed income market. But we don't see your risk profile is really changing just because you're putting a deposit into the plan. I think, in fact, the 10 million that was put in 2015 was deposited proratably within the asset plan.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I want to back up before you get too far
Sure.
into the slides here. Let me back up a couple of them. The one that has the 4 bullets, and the last one being the county would continue to receive reimbursement as if the plan were funded at 83%.
Yeah, so the methodology we've been using, which was blessed by the Commonwealth, is that you would essentially issue a second report. I don't know if I have an example of one. But the second report, which we call a shadow report for lack of a better descriptor, says that you didn't put the 24 million in and it's still underfunded, and the unfunded liability is calculated, and you receive your reimbursement as if it were done that way. And so this is, as I think I mentioned this to you, Clinton County did a pension obligation, and they do it 2 ways: with pension obligation bond, without pension obligation bond, to derive at what is considered to be the net pension cost to the county. And they do it for 2 reasons. One is for reimbursement, and the other one is to track on an annual basis as to whether or not they're actually ahead of the game. I think they did their first one in 2005, and I don't think there's been a single year where by actuarial determination they weren't better off with the funding, meaning they were better off having done the funding as compared to not doing the funding. So it really serves 2 purposes. One is to justify the reimbursement, and the other is to just give them a running baseline of was this the right thing to do.
So the reimbursement we would receive, is it just on the normal costs, or is it on the entire amount?
It's on the entire amount.
Okay,
yeah.
so
you would continue to receive reimbursement on normal costs. That's not going to change,
right.
Unless you have a significant change in your labor force, then it could go up or down.
Okay.
But the unfunded portion then is subject to reimbursement.
And
if we fund it, and that's all we issue, you lose the reimbursement on the unfunded piece, because it's not a payment you're making.
Okay.
So the Commonwealth looks at your pension, actuarially determined pension obligation. They don't look at how you're funding it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, so if we were to do this, this would actually potentially save the Commonwealth money as well.
Well, I don't know that we tell them it saves them money.
I'm not suggesting.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to be funny.
I guess over time it saves a little. Their only concern is that they're not paying you more. They're not concerned about paying you less. They're concerned about paying more. Because their attitude is, if I don't pay you more and you do something, so what? I wouldn't expect you to take less because you're borrowing money. You're funding it. So their attitude is, I'm willing to pay what I was going to pay.
Okay.
This obviously would bring it up to 100% funding. Our conversation with Standard & Poor's is that whether or not you fund it, they do your pension obligation as a long-term obligation, and in their words, a long-term obligation is the same as debt. So, today you have a pension obligation. Maybe in the future OPEB gets converted to the same thing as they continue to refine accounting standards. But they look at any obligation you have like this as a long-term obligation. They don't care if it's a contractual obligation with investors or it's just embedded in the pension plan. They view it as one and the same. So when we present to them and say, well, we're funding at 4, not 7.5%, they view that as, well, you're saving money. That was a good management decision. It's essentially a credit neutral. You're not going to get a gold star for having borrowed this at 4% versus 7.5%. Nor are you going to get a black check mark because you borrowed it and you now have a fixed obligation.
So they don't distinguish that, and I don't want to be characterized as chasing Standard & Poor's rates, but
yeah, and nor do we. By just trying to give you an outside perspective.
But if they don't distinguish soft, obligation or debt.
They do it as an obligation.
It's just we owe it.
Yes.
Our pension.
Yeah, where they do take very keen notice is if you pass on the obligation to fund the soft obligation. That one gets attention. Because that brings them back to, you're not running a structurally balanced budget, and that is in this environment, that's the biggest negative grade you can get at the rating agency, which is a structural, an unbalanced budget. I guess, again, these are legally, this is a legal investment and borrowing proposition. Certainly other counties and municipalities in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have done it. Berks County, Bucks County, the city of Lancaster, Clinton County actually has done it twice. Not to speak negatively of them, but I think they actually funded it once, skipped a few years, funded it again. It was just, I don't know why.
They financed their obligations, then they skipped their ARC.
Then they had a couple tough budget years, so they skipped the ARC, ran another unfunded liability, borrowed it, did another borrowing to bring it back up.
Which county was that?
Clinton.
Oh. Well, this is several years ago, I spoke to one of the Berks County Commissioners, and he was bragging about how his pension plan was 100% funded, and I never delved into it to find out.
That's why.
That's why.
Jay?
Yes.
What you just said goes to my core argument that they funded it, they skipped some years, and then they funded it. That can happen in a transition with new commissioners. We can't obligate them legally with debt.
Well, actually, yes. So in government, if you incur debt, you have obligated the future administration. You don't obligate them to the ARC if you do the pay-go. But once you enter into a debt obligation, every future group of commissioners is obligated. The investor / lender has legal recourse if you don't honor that contract. And maybe I misunderstood your question,
Yes,
but it is, you have obligated them.
What happens is new boards may not honor the commitment that we have to fund the ARC. We have no written plan that we have adopted formally, and there's many things that belong in there. And this is a small piece, and by itself, it does not give us longevity. It needs to be part of a larger written plan. I can't remember all of them that they recommend be included. It's not enough. We need to have the big picture.
That's a little out of my purview. I wasn't asked to address the big picture, so I'll leave that to, if you want us to be a part of that conversation, we're happy to be a part of it, but we've not been asked to look beyond the pension funding as you consider this.
I'm just confused about the ARC is what Commissioner Litz is worried about future boards not honoring.
Right, that's
It has
optional.
nothing to do with the 20 million that we may refinance in a bond, which would be a debt that we would be obligated.
Absolutely, there's
And
no
future
skipping.
boards would be obligated to.
Absolutely, yeah.
So.
I didn't mean to suggest otherwise.
Right.
That was.
No, but that's what I got out of that. But the ARC then would be much smaller because we've moved money over here so that they're.
Yes, so if you fund the unfunded liability with what we call pension obligation bond, that is a contractual obligation. Then what becomes elective, or soft as people call it, would be the normal cost, which right now is running about $750,000. And we would expect that, and I don't see you changing the labor force dramatically, so we don't see that number changing by a lot.
Unless they would change legislatively the defined contribution.
Right, that's correct.
To be clear, if future, as in the case with Clinton County, if future boards do not pay the ARC, then they go and borrow more money because they're back into the same situation they are before the original money was borrowed. That's where it becomes the unfunded liabilities.
Yeah, so the portion that they funded in '05 became contractually, they were contractually bound to that. So what they passed on then became, a couple years, so I would imagine '05, probably coming out of the '08-09 recession / market crash. The plan probably was underfunded given market returns, and they probably passed on that. I don't know all the details, but they actually did a second one then to cure the second. So it wasn't all passing on it. There was some market embedded losses, which is the same risk you would have here. Funding the 24 million does not assure or ensure that there aren't market losses going forward. You're always subject to market risk in the asset plan. That doesn't change. And then there was I guess the last point was there was an article that was provided that suggested it's a Ponzi scheme, and to be clear, a Ponzi scheme is clearly illegal, and it is taking one investor's money to pay the previously registered investor. So it'd be like me saying to Jamie, I'll promise you 10%, but I'd already promised Commissioner Ames 10%, so I take his deposit and I pay all the commissioners to get your 10%. I've got to get the next guy in to pay his percent because I don't have an underlying investment vehicle or strategy. All we're doing here is providing a lower cost to finance your contractual obligation to fund the plan for the beneficiaries. And I think in that article what that gentleman was actually suggesting, I think he was taking the leap that the pension plan in and of itself is a Ponzi scheme because you're taking money from future employees and county budgets to fund retirees. So it's really the next generation paying for this generation. I think he was suggesting that the pension plan in and of itself should be blown up. I think that was his primary objection. But I don't want anybody to think that we've come to you with an idea that was not passing all of the federal, state, and local legal requirements. And so I think we have a very attractive funding option, frankly better than we were expecting, and certainly a couple to choose from. Based on the information we received, I do think the Stiefel Nicholas was the lowest cost. Again, if you have any concern about who is handling all of the pieces of business, we certainly can find other people. Our objective and hope would be that we can force them to the same market level rate as Stiefel Nicholas is proposing. If they get in the market and they can't produce what they promised, we have no obligation to pull the plug. We can always go back to a bank financing that is close but not quite as good. The reality is we took the worst case the bank is offering and compared it to the best case that the investment banker is offering. So, on one hand, we have a worst case and a best case, and we would want to make sure the difference in those is enough that when we get into the market, that if it's not exactly, what was presented, that it's still of enough benefit that it's worthwhile, but it would be part of the evaluation process if you want to proceed. Second then would be, if you want to proceed with this, we would combine the tax-exempt refinancing with this to get some economies of scale out of the professional fees. I would not want to do two separate financings within weeks or months. That would be foolishly spending county money.
In order to combine those, what kind of timing has to take place here?
We would, if you made a decision you wanted to do this, we would come back and amend or just offer a new parameters ordinance so that we would include both. And we've already started the process. It wouldn't take much to add this to the scope of what we're doing and get it to the rating agency. On our side, we can probably move faster than you would get to a public meeting to discuss it.
So then, this portion of it would not count against the borrowing.
Does not count against your borrowing.
And the other still does.
And not that you're up against it, but
no,
just to be clear, because this
it.
is, I think Commissioner Litz had pointed out, this is as much money as you have currently borrowed. So I didn't want anybody to think that, if there's significant 911 or, criminal justice needs in the future, that this would stand in the way of that. It would not.
It would give us an opportunity to either help with some of those IT or some of those costs that we have in planning stages, or reduce tax millage.
You could. There's, as you can see on the schedule we handed out, your savings are, $750,000 to $800,000 a year for the next several years. Combining that with the refunding, we can probably get that $800,000 for a few years, and that would, it's certainly not a mill, but parts are parts, as they say.
John had a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure really plays into this directly.
You're wishing you hadn't come to this meeting.
It could have been worse, he could have invited the actuary here.
When you mentioned the one county that was lowering its investment assumption from 7.5 to 6.5.
Well, they're thinking about it.
Okay.
They haven't not made a decision.
But so they had a choice to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can go to your actuary and say, look, I don't like these assumptions. They don't create the assumptions for you. Now, they've been kind of cast in, concrete, so to speak, because they've been passed from one administration to the next. But there's nothing that statutorily defines what those assumptions are. You have latitude. The county has latitude over those assumptions.
And that's, I guess, what my question would be. Is there a possibility that there could be a statutory definition of what?
Well, certainly possible, yes. The rub in all this is the Commonwealth has the same underfunded pension issue as Lebanon County and everybody else does.
Except to the extreme.
To the extreme, right. So the likelihood that the Commonwealth would pass a law that would increase their unfunded liability, in my opinion, gets you very close to not possible, but I would never dismiss possible. And they've been very, very slow to react to this issue in any way. So exacerbating their unfunded position, I think, is unlikely in the near term. But again, you ask possible, yes, possible.
And then you also had mentioned, I think, that you thought that paying New York may become a statutory obligation. Is that just...
Well, maybe not statutory. The accounting standards keep moving more toward where, in the past this was a footnote. Now it's a real accounting entry, and at some point, I just think it's going to continue to get more and more teeth to it to force
People to fund their pension.
people to fund their pension, exactly, yes, yeah. I do think that's coming. I just think, as you get to these plans that approach 60% funded, I just think there's going to be an outcry to put some more teeth into the funding requirement. That's just an opinion, though. That's certainly not anybody.
And those things happen outside of this decision anyway.
That's
so.
just an opinion. But that's been the trend on the accounting side, which is to put more substance into the accounting, the audited financial statements for governmental entities. And I don't see that trend reversing soon.
Since we're talking about the legislature and what they may or may not do, if at some point there's legislation that allows counties and municipalities to choose between a defined benefit plan and a defined contribution plan, and a county chooses a defined contribution plan, then the unfunded obligation just will eventually get paid off.
Eventually, yeah.
But it doesn't go away.
No.
It's a tail that stays there until
Yeah.
it's gone, no matter what because we still
and
still owe those employees.
Right, and one of the challenges in doing that is every pension plan, again, going back to this Ponzi scheme, the next guy pays for the first guy. Pension plans really work that way. So what you fund tomorrow is funding the guy who's here today. So if the next guy coming in isn't part of that defined benefit plan and he's not contributing to it, for a period of time you exacerbate the funding issue because you have fewer people paying in, but you have the same employees who are getting closer to retirement and receiving benefits in that plan, and the very young employees who have a long life span of work before they're going to take benefits aren't part of that calculation. So that's one of the challenges, which is, okay, you can cut it off.
It defunds your...
Everybody starting August 1st is a defined benefit, not a defined benefit. It gets worse for a period of time. So nobody really wants to kind of jump head first into that because there's a period of pain before you get to the gain.
The reward.
Yeah, it all depends on your turnover rate and so on.
Yeah, a lot of variables in there, but on the surface, you have fewer people contributing.
But it's still the right way to go.
Yeah, and actuarially, the guy, the person who starts at age 25
Thank you, Jim.
it is, on a present value basis, costing a lot less than all of us in this room would be in that plan.
And the same sort of conversation happens around Social Security.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Stop the plan, and we got to stop funding. So it's a big issue. you know, I don't know that anybody, you know, like Social Security, I'm not sure anybody ever contemplated the dollar of benefits being paid out would be as great as they are. You know, I know when I was on the school board, we did a calculation, and, you know, a teacher who works 30 years in the first 2.5 years had consumed all of their individual contributions to the plan. And so you have somebody retiring at age 55 or 60 with another 20 plus years of life expectancy, 18 plus years are all on the taxpayer, only 2 years came out of the employee's contribution. When all of these plans started, you know, most people didn't live past their 60s when Social Security was created. We've added 20 plus years to the expected life, and the funding formula is out of whack. We're just not putting enough money in the plan for the now length of life that we're experiencing.
Anything else?
I think that's it. I mean, you know, we do have a couple, we have bank proposals that are live, so we either need to act or reject them. I certainly don't think you're prepared to make a decision today, but I do think, based on what we have received, that there is a very attractive alternative for you to consider.
How long are those open?
Good question.
Middle of August?
Pardon?
Middle of August?
We probably can get the full one's the only one I think that is worth extending. We probably can get it extended. I don't think I have a paper copy, but I'll email you.
Well, rates haven't really.
Rates, they've
so they
moved,
would be-
you know, from their proposal, probably haven't moved at all. They dropped a little bit after their proposal came in, and we're probably back to where they sent it in. Usually they're good for 30 days.
Right.
We can probably get it extended. We've had, you know, in the past, they've been very agreeable to extend. I think when we did the funding, they extended it 3 or 4 weeks. That's something.
Yeah, yeah.
And as long as rates don't, you know, start going dramatically one way or the other, we should be fine. It would, you know, we would need an authorization by way of an ordinance, which we would, as I said earlier, go back and combine with the refunding so we get the economies of scale. If you just decide to continue to pay as you go, then we'll just proceed with the tax exempt refunding.
And as far as your services go, there's unless something happens here, there's no fee, but that was addressed. That was addressed with the.
We charge a lot of goodwill.
That was addressed with the agreement.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Adopted.
yeah, it's a contingent fee. Yeah. I mean, we brought the idea to you, so I don't, you know, wouldn't expect to be paid for something that we're asking you to consider before you've had a chance to fully vet it and make a decision.
Thank you. I mean, it's a $10 million, it's kind of hard not to consider, but there are some philosophical issues that I think we're dealing with.
Yeah, when you look at the numbers, it's a very compelling case. You know, I think it really comes down to the public policy issue.
You might ask the members of the press what's your opinion.
They're not like that one.
Yeah, John's back, it's not the new guy.
Bob, you've been quiet. Do you have any observations or questions?
You know, I'm sort of torn one way or the other, you know, it looks good, and as I expressed to the Commissioner Ames this morning, my one concern was that if they chose to go this way, being able to get that reimbursement.
Well, clearly, it would be contingent upon that. Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you can't maintain reimbursement.
Because otherwise, we would only be able to get reimbursement on that
Yeah, and you're kind of back to pay as you go is, you know,
Yeah.
worse, probably better. So absolutely, yeah.
That was my.
Yeah, and it's, you know, Clinton County's been doing it since '05, never had I'll double check the date. I think it was 2005.
Because the agencies are now geared toward giving, they're in their second year of giving a certain, and I think Kevin Trum was the one who alluded that once they get into like a 2 or 3 year pattern, then the state assumes that's going to come every year.
Right.
And then suddenly that drops. I don't know what.
Yeah, we did this for Bristol Township back probably 06, 07, and they've been getting reimbursement. So, I mean, we don't know of anybody who's not, but that certainly would be a very important piece of this. Otherwise, you're really subsidizing the state.
Correct.
Madam Treasurer, any observations or comments?
In the savings, of course, you look at that, like they said, that's a good side of it. So it would free up our budget for some of the money, like the improvements that we do want to do. I mean, that would help there, I think, with the IT and all that. would help with that.
I guess it boils down, the philosophical part is if you consider the pension obligation to be a hard debt, and I do. I mean, I think we are obligated to our pensioners and our employees, so I don't look at it as an optional, soft obligation. I think it's well beyond that. I think that's where I think, why wouldn't you take the money as a savings for the county and the taxpayers in one way or the other? Either we upgrade or do some things we were going to do anyway, or we return some in tax forgiveness.
I mean, another way to look at this is if the present value savings are $10 million, over 25 years, the asset, this piece of the asset plan could lose $10 million and you get a break even.
I mean, the timing is the issue, especially because there are times Sally's struggling to pay the bills. Hard debt, we must pay it monthly. The soft debt, we come up in when we have the money.
Yeah, the hard debt would be structured with annual principal and semi-annual interest expense as your general obligation bonds are. If there are months of the year where your cash flow is better, we can structure the payments in those months. If your budget process is you put away 1/6 of the interest every month and 1/12 of the principal, then it doesn't matter when the payments are. But we can look at your cash flow cycle and schedule. Maybe interest payments should be April and October.
We do that, that's what we do now, and we set that money aside as we get taxes in. And I think even with the say, if you look at it, your ARC payment is gonna be a lot less right there, you're gonna make your payment basically.
Yeah, this would be April.
So I mean, it would
Exactly
be,
the same.
you would be using the $2 million that we're putting in the ARC basically to pay for this,
In part, yes.
yeah.
And weight it toward the latter part of the year. Right. You have the larger part of the payment.
Yeah,
Because
using
that's how
October.
we have it now. It's
I think that's
April's
what the
April's the
principal
interest,
payments-
it's a lighter payment.
I think there's one that we
October's
do some
the,
principal in, but it wasn't the bond issue, it was the loans, I think.
so I think from a cash management
Yeah.
perspective, and Sally and I do that almost daily,
Yeah.
but this could be set aside just like the ARC has been set aside for this year, so
Yeah.
it wouldn't be, it shouldn't be a struggle.
Commissioner Anderson.
No, well, I'm just confused by what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that, maybe we shouldn't do this because the ARC, we don't have to pay if we don't have the money, which is how the county got in this mess in the first place, because prior commissioners didn't pay it for whatever reason, didn't step up and meet the obligation. And then I'm hearing that, well, if we do this, then maybe they won't pay the future ARC, and then they would have to re-borrow money again. That whole argument just doesn't make sense to me, because why would you go back to doing what you did and you know it created this problem in the first place? Why would you not, now that we're trying to right this ship, why wouldn't you meet that obligation? And as far as us determining what future boards can do, we don't have that right. We can't assure that. So we're not going to do something here that's other than, if we choose to do this, future boards are going to have to meet the obligation of the debt that we're ensuing now. We're not changing the amount of debt that we owe. We already owe the $24 million. What we're trying to do is facilitate some way to limit that obligation from $60 million to, or whatever, and lower it by $10.5 million over the term. So I don't understand how arguing to do what we've already done, which was proved to be incorrect, as opposed to meeting an obligation, which, as Mr. Wanger indicated, is not a monthly payment. We can pay it, quarterly or annually or whatever we've been doing with our other obligations. So I don't understand that argument at all.
Today is the first day I heard that it was not a monthly obligation, number one. And number two, I never suggested that we don't pay it. I suggested there might be months that we couldn't pay it and would have to, with the soft payment, we could adjust it to when we do have it within that year, as opposed to right before the taxes start coming in. And as to talking about why wouldn't we, it's not us, it's the future boards. If we do not have a written financial policy for them to read, to become educated, and we're not around, who's going to tell them? Jamie could be leaving, you could be leaving, he could be leaving, I could be
know I'm
leaving. So therefore, we need a structured, written policy that encompasses all the things that the audits tell us we have to have in that written financial policy. We've been ignoring it. How can we move ahead with this without a full written plan, long-term, so that we can communicate to the future boards, even though we can't obligate them, but we can at least explain our reasoning, our rationale, and tell them what's going to happen if you don't follow this plan.
But we certainly are able to do that, because you were a member of a board that didn't meet that obligation.
Yes, but so were you.
That's right, until
Thank
we
you.
decided what we were going to do here, yes. And until we convinced you, which we never did, that we needed to sell a hard asset in order to meet part of this obligation and begin to straighten out the finances of the county.
It's hard.
It could have been done earlier had you agreed to sell Cedar Haven in a timely fashion.
It's hard to have to rehash everything, but we do.
Well,
have
you do it all the time, so
over
I'm used to it.
We do have over $8 million in cash that we could use instead of having to borrow it.
And we'd be right back where we were before, Commissioner. I don't.
It's a futile attempt.
Yeah.
Yes.
On that point, the opinion from bond counsel is the portion of the 2011 bonds that were attributable to the energy project in Cedar Haven, we have to use proceeds from Cedar Haven, so of that $8 million, we're going to spend about $1.3 million to pay off that portion of the 2011 bonds. And that'll happen whether or not you refinance this or the other debt. We have to take some amount of your $8 million that was put into reserves to pay off that portion of the debt.
We're just going to,
Just as a point.
not to belabor this rehash, but whoever the administrator is or whoever the elected officials are that handle it will be educating the new commissioners coming in much as we were. And then they do the best that they can with the information they're given. But would you, Sally, as the treasurer, advocate for depleting our cash on hand? No, I mean, that's...
I remember coming into office in 2004, we did not have to do a tran in January to pay our bills until several years later.
It was a decade
We
ago.
always had a reserve up to a certain time.
And there is a
And it was
reserve there that's being ignored. And they're saying, well, we're gonna keep it there in case we have to go back, but it's a reserve and we're not utilizing it.
Which reserve is that?
There's about $4 million in addition to the $8 million, so that's 12. If you add up all the money, we have as much, and granted, some of it is obligated for payroll.
Not some, most.
We have over $20 million in the bank right now. And we have the opportunity to pay down the debt without having to borrow all that money.
The $20 million that you're referring to is mostly payrolls from now to the end of the year.
I think 12 million of it is unobligated.
I know.
I don't have the sheet in front of me.
And then if you're referring to the refunds from health insurance, those, I mean, you have some flexibility with those, but those have stayed there as with the ability to cover a bad year, which inevitably everybody has in health
Or
insurance.
to take care of
So
a capital obligation, because we have no,
If you-
unmandated priority fund.
if you want to lump that over in with Cedar Haven proceeds, I think you could. But at this point, they've been segregated. But back to the $20 million, I mean, that has been set aside. It's almost like when people go to the bank and they cash their paycheck and they take different envelopes for different bills, and it still happens these days.
I
That's
totally
exactly what we're
acknowledge,
doing.
I totally acknowledge that.
And it's also our
I'm
debt
just saying the
payments.
4 million in round figures is not being accounted for as a carryover, and it is. Because you can have bad anything and have to, use it. We have a carryover, we're just not acknowledging it.
You're part of the Benetcon consortium, right?
Yes.
Have they given you a adequate reserve amount we should maintain? Don't they actuarially determine?
We
what
fully
reserve-
fund every year. We
But don't
pay
they-
max premium.
Don't they provide what you should have X number of dollars on hand for that?
No, they just tell you in bad years, here's what you owe.
um,
We just haven't had any of those
As
for
I
a
was on
little
the school
while.
board, we were given every year, here's how much you should have in reserve, and it was millions.
But I kind of feel like Bob said too, you know, it is an obligation that we have to fulfill, and if we can do it, I think it's something we should certainly, you know, move ahead with possibly if it works out to be the best thing to do.
We'll think on it. And
Yeah, I wasn't looking for a conclusion today, I just wanted to update you on what we've received by way of funding options and give you a little more data to think about. I think we've now provided as much market information as we can. I don't know what else. I mean, if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to research them, but I think this is the full picture to make a decision one way or the other.
John,
I just have one question. Are all of the funding options you're talking about related to bonds, or are some bank loans?
Two were bank loans, and then we had two different investment banking firms give us their idea of where they could sell bonds in the marketplace.
So Fulton was a bank loan.
Yes, yeah, and again, you know, 24 million is a pretty big loan for a community bank, so you have to get to a certain size bank before somebody can actually entertain the loan requests. We had asked PNC, they did not respond. We did not ask Wells Fargo because they are generally unresponsive in a community like this. We did not ask M&T. On the government side, they're not very responsive. Not to say they wouldn't, but we just not